say less snowy than last week, but you know, can't tell that snow coming down. There's snow off the roof. But here we are. Glad to be back again this week. What we're going to do is kind of two things. I thought last week we didn't leave enough room for questions around Jesus in the various groups. So I thought I'd kind of end that portion, maybe open it up for some questions, and then we're going to shift for the next 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks. We're going to look at gender in the Roman world, how men and women were thought of, how they depicted them, and how that affects various texts that we look at in the New Testament. It's actually much more relevant than we might imagine. So that's kind of a twofold task for this morning. Kind of retread some ground where we finished last week, and then begin on the role of men in the Roman world. All right, so last week as we were ending, we kind of ended in a flurry, because I saw the time was a little bit late, and make sure we got to church. But what we were doing last week, if you weren't here, is we were comparing Jesus to the known groups that we know about in the Jewish world. So Jesus is born as a Jew. He lives a Jewish life. He is forever in that way Jewish. And so he's not separate from that world. As I was telling students earlier this week, it's not as if Jesus can think of something outside of that, or Paul, outside of that horizon. He is a Jewish person. And like that, he's then caught up in some of the same questions, challenges, and opportunities that all Jews in the Roman world faced. And we're going to look at one text today where he actually is right in the middle of it. And so by knowing the groups that Jesus is around, some of them that we see in the Gospels, some that we don't, it helps to show where Jesus kind of lands on a spectrum, if you will, on a variety of topics. And so what we did is we took the kind of 4 major groups that we know about, coming from a Jewish historian named Josephus. He actually lists 3. He lists the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and then we have another group called the Zealots. Now, as we mentioned last week, 2 of these groups explicitly appear in the Gospels, in the New Testament. We meet Pharisees and Sadducees all throughout Jesus' ministry. And of course, Paul calls himself a Pharisee in Philippians chapter 2. So we know about Pharisees. Sadducees are only a group around in the Gospels, really. We meet them a little bit in Acts, but not that much. Mainly because Sadducees are Jerusalem-based. They control the temple. They don't really go outside of there, outside of southern Israel. They're not going around the Roman world. So we really only meet them near the end of Jesus' life. And they control the temple precincts. They run the sacrifices, run the liturgical calendar, offering prayers, all there in Jerusalem. And this all, of course, comes to a crashing end when the Romans destroy the temple in 70 CE. And essentially, for lack of a better word, their power base literally evaporates, and then they are left. There's no real reason to have Sadducees anymore, because there's no place to offer sacrifice anymore after 70. The Pharisees, I argued last week, are a lot more closer in outlook to Jesus' own outlook, in terms of how they view Scripture, how they view their place kind of in God's world, what God is up to, a theme of repentance. Where I mentioned that they disagree, of course, is over his identity. Is he the Messiah or not? They obviously have a resounding no. He's not a Messiah. He's a false Messiah. Hence why we get a death penalty, right, at the end of his life. The rule for false prophets in the Old Testament is that you stone them. And so they're trying to carry out, in some ways, what they believe to be the punishment for a false prophet. The Essenes are the group that we don't meet on the pages of the New Testament, at least explicitly. But they're out at the Dead Sea, out at Qumran, most likely producing what we now know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Josephus tells us there's actually multiple sects of the Essenes. They're not just one big monolithic group. In fact, I was looking at some texts with students last week on Josephus, because we have a lot of fun at Gordon College in the Political Studies Department. We're reading Josephus because why not? And he actually says the Essenes actually disagree on the role of marriage in their community. Some argue for celibacy and singleness, and some argue that you should get married because of desires, which I mentioned to my students sounds a lot like Paul in 1 Corinthians saying, should you get married or should you not? Eschatologically, what's happening. And so the Essenes we actually don't meet through the New Testament explicitly, but they certainly are around in Jesus' day. They have left the temple because in that Maccabean period, right after Alexander the Great, they believe that the temple has become corrupted, that it needs to be cleansed by God. And so they hightail out to the desert basically waiting for an apocalyptic coming cosmic battle where good and evil, the sons of light and the sons of darkness are going to go to war, and God is going to rid the world of evil and restore it. Of course, you might begin to see some overlaps with some New Testament thinking there about a coming battle, the classic question of good versus evil, and God's role in vindicating the world of evil. So they're out there at the Dead Sea. They're copying a bunch of scripture. In fact, most of our understanding of the Old Testament manuscripts that are behind your English versions are aided by what we found out there, because there's just multiple copies of Isaiah, Psalms, the prophets. So they're primarily copying scripture and then writing their own documents about their own kind of monastic life. So they have a text called the Community Rule, which is essentially like a Rule of Benedict, but hundreds of years earlier, of how is their life going to run together in this monastic community. The Essenes believe that they are part of the new covenant. So when they go out there, they think that they're forming the new covenant that Jeremiah talked about in Jeremiah chapter 31 and Ezekiel 36 and 37. And so just to put the obvious one on the table, there are multiple Jewish groups in the first century saying, we are members of the new covenant. We're the part of the new thing that God is doing. The Qumran groups think that. Obviously, Jesus, Paul, and the early Christians believe that they're members of the new covenant. So there's lots of ways that other Jews are interacting. Finally, just in terms of this kind of quick summary, the Zealots are the kind of violent revolutionary groups willing to go to war to throw off Roman rule and to get rid of Jews that they think are sympathizing too much with Roman rule. I mentioned, I think last week, there's a group we know as the Sicarii, which is a short dagger, and they will go to Jewish festivals and take out high-standing Jewish people who they believe are collaborating with Rome too closely. So they have like a hit list. They go to the Jewish festivals and they kill other Jews who they believe are impeding, right, the overthrow of the Roman Empire. So, inter-religious violence, if you will, because they see people as a threat. The reason I mention that is, right, Jesus' entire ministry is kind of flogged with the idea of, is he going to lead a revolution? And what type is it going to be? Will there be swords involved, right? Paul, when we first meet him, is standing over the death of another Jewish person, right? Stephen. And so it's all to say that this is part of that first century world where, religious violence is certainly part of the landscape and not off the table. As I mentioned, right, where Jesus stands most distinct from this group is with his consistent message of nonviolence. Turn the other cheek, pray for those who persecute you. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. You can line up the Jesus text where he's radically diverging from the kind of more violent Second Temple Jewish groups. There's a pretty stark difference there between Jesus and those groups. So these are kind of the big four, if you will. And so I want us to think about a text. Can't remember if we did this last week. It's been a long week. I don't know about you. But remember, Jesus one time is approached in Jerusalem, and he's flipped a coin, and he's asked by the groups, Sadducees and Pharisees, should we pay taxes? Right? It's a seemingly interesting question, right, in the first century. But if you have these four groups in front of you, at least these four, let's say they're all in that arena, in that venue, let's say they all hear the question, Jesus has really just been handed kind of like a political hand grenade, right? Because however he responds to that question, he's going to alienate one of these groups on the screen, right? So how does Jesus answer the question when asked if they should pay taxes? Yeah, so he starts off with the question, whose picture is on the coin? Pretty obvious. It's probably Tiberius at this point, right? Oh, looks like it's Tiberius' coin. So he says, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and give to God's what is God's. In a really interesting way, Jesus has a really politically brilliant response, right? Because if he had said, don't pay your taxes, right? No, like resist. He's alienated, most likely the Sadducees, right? They're the ones working with Rome, trying to keep the peace, kind of legislating a peaceful coexistence with Rome, trying to use the mechanisms of power. Rome's not going to take nicely to hearing that someone's not paying their taxes. And the Sadducees are going to bear the brunt of that because that's their role to keep the people kind of in line, right? So if he says don't pay, the Sadducees go, oh, he's one of those zealot types, right? I can peg him now. He's in that category because he's anti-Roman taxes, which a lot of people were. We got some really fun stories about that I will share later. But if he says pay your taxes, right? He's now alienated which group? Zealots. Who's like, oh, he's one of those aristocratic, Sadducean, work with the people who are the overlords over us. Maybe we need to put him on our list at the next festival, right? So he's kind of handed this little kind of like ticking time bomb. And again, I would argue that his kind of politically brilliant response is that he kind of says what everybody wants to hear, right? Or at least if you walked away from that conversation, you could walk away feeling very heard and that Jesus is on your side, right? The Sadducees walk away and say, well, he did say pay your taxes, right? He didn't not say that. And then the Zealots might walk away and go, yeah, but did you hear his last line? His last line was, give to God's what is God's, which is another way of saying, what's God's, right? And the answer from that, from a Jewish perspective, is, of course, everything, right? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness of it, right? And so Jesus has this response that kind of deftly moves him out of these landmines that are about to go off, and each group can kind of hear what they want to hear in that response. And so by understanding the various groups, you see why certain questions become very politically provocative, right, in the first century. Yeah?
I've always thought that his response is pretty cryptic. Do you think one possible interpretation is just act as your conscience tells you you should?
So the question is, that cryptic response, is it a way of saying just do kind of whatever you feel led to do? I'm not sure because, Roman taxation is not optional for anyone in the room unless they do want some skirmishes with Rome. I think it's more in the sense he's trying to give, how do we say, plausible deniability to both groups. If I didn't say that, I did say pay your taxes. So I don't know if it's as much as allowing each group to do what they want, because then it just puts it right back where it is. Now, we don't know if the Zealots are not paying taxes, but one of the first things that they do when the war kicks off with Rome is that they go to the temple where the tax records are kept, and they light them on fire, right? Because if you don't have a bill, you can't collect anything, right? It's literally their first act is light the debt records on fire because they can't collect what they don't know, right? Which, as someone carrying some student debt, a logic checks, right? Yeah.
So, if you did an economic analysis of these four groups, how do they fund themselves?
Oh, yeah. So if we do economic analysis, how do they fund themselves? So the Sadducees are probably the easiest. They get their income from the temple, so they're paid from some of the portions of food. They're paid probably by just some of the temple taxes that go to run the temple. Very similar to tithing today, right? Their income comes from the service. The other groups get a little bit harder, and this may be why when we meet Paul, he has a skill alongside being a Pharisee. He's a tent maker and a Pharisee. So Pharisees might not have been self-supporting in that kind of job role. They may have had another task. Josephus, I just found this out last week, I was reading a little bit more closely. He lists someone who's actually a Sadducee and a Pharisee. He lists someone in the first century, about the year 180, that is both a Sadducee and a Pharisee. So people might have had multiple positions. Everyone else is probably just working their craft, and you're kind of a zealot on the weekends, right? Monday through Friday, hat on, nose to the grind. No, they don't really have weekends in the ancient world either. But yeah, zealots were probably not like a career. Yes, Bruce. Yeah.
It seems to me the whole coin episode is reminiscent of him saying no one can serve two masters,
Yep.
Mammon or God.
Yep.
So it's not just about taxation. It's really, it seems to me, goes deeper.
Yeah, Bruce mentioned, and it's an important point, whenever we look at Jesus' sayings, we can't kind of keep them in isolation, right? So he is going to say other things about not serving God and mammon. We're going to find his temptation, that all the kingdoms of the world are his, right? Whose are the kingdoms? Some very interesting lines there in Luke's gospel. Luke adds a line to the temptation narrative, where when Jesus responds, Jesus says they've been given to you, the kingdoms of this world. And so we have these little subtle lines that maybe the Roman Empire isn't as on the up and up, right? But it's part of underneath kind of demonic kind of control. So we need to add all these things up. And a lot of Jews in the first century probably just didn't like Roman rule. It wasn't great, right? Although I'm always reminded of the great Life of Brian quote, right? Like, what has Rome ever done for us? Which, by the way, does not work anymore with undergraduates, I'm sorry to say. Some of them will still chuckle, so like the comedy works. But there is this kind of balance right with the Romans. What have they done for us? There are roads and water and, oh yeah, education, right? But apart from that, it's a pretty brutal regime that stamps out any disobedience. And so yeah, Jesus I don't think would be, well, in some ways it's just adapting to reality as it is. We'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but the first century Jesus followers, Jesus himself, Paul, the earliest Christians, we might have covered this the first week, right? They're not voting anyone into power. Like there's no elections here, right? For the Senate, for the emperor, you're just adapting to the power realities as they are, and trying to do your best. So a lot of the adaptation is just life preservation, because to step out of line is to risk your life, right? Bloodshed is what happens next, because Rome will just brutally crush, any kind of whiff of dissent. And so so paying taxes is just, you're going to do it. You might not like it. We actually have records of towns actually moving between tax collections. So they literally pick up shop and move down the road because they don't want the Romans to come and find them anymore, which is a really fascinating way to avoid taxes, move, right? Really distinct ways. I think as I mentioned last week, in the year 6 BC, right as Jesus is born, there's a tax revolt in Galilee by a guy named Judas the Galilean that destroys the town of Sepphoris, which is about 3 miles outside of where Jesus is born. And so there's lots of mini tax revolts going on. And so when Jesus is offered this question, it's a lively question because it's taking a lot from the people. Lots of poverty is also related to the taxation issue, what Rome is taking in to fund the empire. A question back there?
Were the scribes a vocational group so they could be working for the Pharisees or the Sadducees?
Yes, excellent question. So the scribes, we haven't talked about them. Yeah, scribes are a kind of a hired hand. They are essentially the legal lawyers for any group, kind of like canon law, right? So you have a special set of scribes that know your text really, really well. So Herod has his scribes, the Pharisees have scribes. Actually, Jesus probably has his own scribes as well. Jesus talks about scribes of the kingdom of heaven. And it's really anyone who's trained in reading and writing. So it's a skilled trade. And so you know text really, really well. So we have scribes all throughout the Roman world, which essentially are your kind of legal lawyers to help you figure out where's the law that says this, what am I allowed to do, what's the precedent. Someone has to keep track of that. So that's the scribe's role. Great question.
I know you're going to speak about gender in the future, but as a woman, I'm looking at this group. Am I anywhere in here? Or are you all men and I just happen to be married to a Pharisee, or am I dating a Sadducee?
You select your option, like what group are you into, right? Sadly, there's not representation for women in these groups. Women can't be Pharisees. They can't be Sadducees. I don't think we have any examples of zealots that were women. There are women at the Qumran community. Women are out there doing living life just as everybody else is. I don't think they have any official roles in the community, but they are out there with because families would convert to Qumran. Convert's not the right word. They would move over, and so the entire family would show up. So we have women out at Qumran. We have evidence of that. Of course, there's the debate on marriage at Qumran. Should they get married? Not a lot of references. So we're going to put that in contrast, right, with Jesus, who calls female disciples in the first century. Luke chapter 8, I think verse 30, right, says a group of women followed Jesus around and financially supported him. He meets with Mary and Martha in a discipleship kind of teaching role. We'll look at that story probably next week. That was really fascinating from Luke's perspective because he's training them for ministry. The word serving there with Mary and Martha is not housework. It's the word diakonia, the word that we get our word deacon from. And so when she says, I'm busy with the service, right, serving, that's the word for deacon that we get our our word from, right? And so when she's busy doing the work of ministry. She's not just busy tidying up the house and cooking casseroles, right? She's out there and she's frustrated with Mary, who's not helping run the ministry. So it's in a very different way. And so I think, we'll see Jesus kind of stands, really uniquely there with the role of women in his orbit. And then we'll see the same with Paul, actually, kind of counterintuitively. So, great. So these are the 4 groups. I think it helps us see where Jesus lands. And we landed last week on this, and we'll kind of wrap up with this. At the heart of, I would say, the people of God is a tension of kind of the twin aspects of identity here. This applies, I think, for us as well, right? So in Exodus 19, we get the famous lines, so be holy for I am holy, right? Holiness means separate, distinct, set apart, dedicated to a special task, right? So you get kind of this like holiness mentality as we have seen in these texts. And then right alongside that, right, you kind of have the cardinal call of God's people to be a blessing to the nations. And right there you get the tension, right? Because those two identities are kind of arch the opposite way. One is to be set apart, be distinct. One is about being with, right? Be a blessing to the. It's hard to be a blessing when you're distant, right? So the question comes: how do we interact with the nations? How do we interact with people who are distinct and different from us? And as you can see on that group, right, each group kind of draws that line in a different place. We usually think of the Pharisees as the more like holy group in the first century. Yet it's actually the ones at Qumran who actually took that a step farther and actually left. You're talking about being distinct. They went out and formed their own desert community. Like utter distinction, utter holiness, right, at some level. Very removed from hospitality. The Pharisees disagree on where that hospitality line should be drawn. I mentioned last week, right, the number one charge the Pharisees give Jesus is that he eats, keyword there, with tax collectors and sinners. The charge is that Jesus is being too hospitable. You're fraternizing too much with the groups. You need to be more distinct. And so this is, I would argue, at the heart of even our modern day disagreements. Where is that line between holiness and hospitality? I think as I kind of really quickly finished last week, I think Jesus is one of the ways that he is a revolutionary, is not just in nonviolence, but I think in seeing hospitality as a means of holiness. That Jesus' presence has a profound effect on people. It's meeting him and being transformed. We see this in some of the healings, right? Rather than catching leprosy, right, by touching someone with the lepra disease, he actually heals them, right? They become whole, not less, and he doesn't become, unclean. And so I think you see that in his kind of radical actions, that Jesus' presence brings people in. It takes someone like Zacchaeus, chief tax collector and sinner, and makes him repentant. So he says, I'm going to sell half my possessions, and if I've wronged anybody, I'm going to pay back 4 times, right? So notice Jesus' interaction with those groups has a profound transformative effect of bringing them into the kingdom, where the least, the last, and the lost, right, are now included. They're at the banquet table. And this seems to be what gets the ire, at least of the Pharisees, is they don't like who's at the party. They don't like who's around the table. And Jesus is kind of reconfiguring that around himself, hence his identity claims. He can do that because he says, I'm the Messiah. And so this, I would argue, kind of shows the tensions there in the Gospels, at least at one level, of why these groups are disagreeing. What are they going to be doing, and how are they going to be really navigating the course of ancient Israel? Because really at the heart of this, right, to be a Messiah is to be the king of Israel. The term Mashiach means anointed one, and refers to that process in the Old Testament where the prophet would pour oil, right, over the king's head, like with Saul and David, right? That's a Mashiach. Mashiach is the king, it's the leader. So at the heart of the disagreements here is Jesus going to be the one to lead the movement? Is he going to take us where we think we should be going? And in the first century, you have a lot of answers saying, no, we don't like where he's taking us. In fact, we think he's leading us to destruction. So we better get him out of the driver's seat and take the car back over. And so this is where really the claim that Jesus makes is, am I going to lead? Am I going to be the Messiah for this movement? And of course, some Jews in the first century say yes. Peter, James, Paul, some of the crowds, all the disciples that he gathers. and others say no. They think that he's a false Messiah, a false prophet. And there you get to see that kind of disagreement. Yeah.
Jason, how would each of the four address the right-hand part of this slide? Because
Yeah.
it seems straightforward that each of the four took very seriously the concept of holiness.
Yep.
But it's not so clear how they would have thought about hospitality.
Yeah, so the question of how the other groups face the hospitality issue, and that does appear to be, let me put it this way. So I teach a class on hermeneutics at Gordon, and if you were to set out all the texts on a table of the Old and New Testament, we'd fill this room with pages of scripture, right? And so there's always a question on what do you highlight? What do you focus on? What texts rise to prominence that help you interpret all the others, right? Because as texts, they're just sitting there, right? They've got to be activated by a reader, and they've got to be interpreted and kind of chosen in a what we call hermeneutical framework, right, to interpret all the others. And so I'd argue they know of this text, but this one's dominant. So it's helping us interpret, well, we're going to be holy to the extent that it's going to frame the hospitality question. And from there, we get, as you might imagine, right, a lot of responses from Jews in the Second Temple period on the role of the Gentiles. They range from some pretty staggering ones that they're all going to be destroyed in the eschaton because all Gentiles are bad. They're pagans. They worship bad gods, wrong gods, and God's going to destroy them. That's obviously rooted in some level of a really awful history between Gentiles and Jews, right? There's lots of bad blood there. And so some groups just say there's no place for Gentiles. They're unless they convert, they're gone. The middle kind of position is that from Isaiah, at one point the Gentiles are going to flock to Jerusalem, but that's in the eschaton. And so some of these groups may have said, yeah, there's a place for them, but in the age to come. When God comes back, they'll see Yahweh in all of his beauty, they'll see the truth, and they'll turn, right? And so it's something in the future where Gentiles will make that move. The third and rather most unlikely position that you see some of our gospel writers taking is that the Gentiles will be included as Gentiles in God's kingdom. And so we kind of stand 2,000 years downstream from a lot of choices. Well, we take it for granted that we're in the room, that we have a place in this thing. It wasn't always the case, right? It's really the work of Paul, Barnabas, some of the early Christians out of Antioch that made a case by interpreting Scripture that Gentiles will have a place in the community of God by not converting to Judaism, but by being Gentiles. So you have a whole range of spectrum from essentially annihilation to conversion to this kind of third emerging category of Gentiles may just come as Gentiles. So yeah, lots of varied responses on that nation's questions. I would say most probably put it in the future. In the present, they're free to convert if they want.
But none of these four groups put hospitality in an especially important role. That was left to Jesus and his followers.
Yeah, so you're going to have a kind of standard sense of just first century hospitality, of just treating people nicely, welcoming them in. But especially hospitality towards outsiders, probably not. Yeah, so Jesus is going to elevate that a lot more by his activity. And then certainly as the Jesus followers go out into the nations, Matthew 28, go therefore into all the nations, that's going to rise that up. And so I think a text like Matthew 28, stemming from Jesus, shows the big interest in that. And Paul does believe he's in an eschatological ingathering of Gentiles. I mean, he's not entirely out of that framework. He believes God is at work in a new way. But that's all for early Jesus followers. That's the weird time lapse that happens, is that everyone would agree that resurrection happens. Well, some groups would, right? Everyone agrees that maybe Gentiles might come in the eschaton. The game changer for the early Christians, as N.T. Wright puts it, is that what they thought would happen at the end of time happened in the middle of time to one person. So Jesus gets resurrected in the middle of time and changes the table, if you will. The Spirit descends at Pentecost. Remember the prophecy from Joel, in the last days I will pour out my Spirit, is what Joel says. And Peter says that end time is breaking into the middle. And that's what messes all the timelines up, if you will, is that everything they thought was in the future is happening kind of in the middle. And so that's where Jesus and Paul, especially with their views on Gentiles, aren't entirely out of that orbit, necessarily. It's just where they're at in the timeline, essentially. Yeah.
I mean, speaking about tensions that we might talk about,
Yeah.
one of the questions about what role do women have in any of these groups?
Yep.
A lot of us come from a Christian faith tradition that still wants to keep people, women
Yeah.
in that space
Yep.
today, 2,000 years later,
Yep.
regardless of what Paul did,
Mhm.
regardless of what Jesus did. And I think we just need to be
Mhm.
honest about
Mhm.
the environment
Yeah.
that's still happening.
No, that's a helpful reminder that obviously they're still in for a long time, until relatively recently, right? Women have not had other roles outside of these ones either, right? And so yeah, there's a long history of, well, I think Jesus taking steps forward and then multiple steps back, right? And so yeah, the role of women in religious communities, they're there if you know where to look sometimes, but they don't take the dominant story usually in history. But yeah, it's not just Jesus in those groups, and it's hey, we fixed it all, right? Yeah, we actually have groups actively working against some of those things as well.
Elevated ways.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why I think it's helpful with these topics to see what are Jesus and Paul up to in the first century world. And I was just speaking with someone earlier. It's amazing sometimes how much of just Roman culture people just want to kind of revivify and bring back, right? And at least from my vantage point, those are some of the things that Jesus and Paul were actually going for against, right? And seeking to undermine, and yet we have a rebuilding of that. I think we'll see that as we go forward. All right, well, shift gears just a little bit. What I want to do is, let me switch slides here real quick. Another thing that kind of looms in the background of all of our New Testament texts, you might say, you might say the Old Testament as well, is the concept of gender and sex. So what I want to do today, this is kind of a shorter one, it's kind of a setup in some ways for talking about women in the ancient world. Don't know why that stopped working.
It came on.
Oh, it did?
For a second.
Okay. Let's see what this is again. Okay. There we go. There we go. Maybe? There we go. Okay. So we're looking at the ways that the ancient world thought about concepts of gender in terms of masculinity and femininity, or male and female. And so obviously we live in a world where this is obviously an ever-present topic. And counterintuitively, I would argue that it's actually always been a contested topic. It's not as if it's just like reappeared, right? You can go back in different eras and see debates on what should men be doing, what should women be doing. And what we might not imagine is that this is very much a controversial topic in the first century as well. It's not as if they were just like all humming along with their various conceptions. They were actually debating these texts and these ideas as well. And so in many ways, some New Testament texts are actually also wrapped up with that conversation. So I have a couple of texts on the screen. Some are a little bit more obvious. Some are a little bit less obvious. 1 Corinthians 16, Paul urges some in the audience to act like men, quote unquote. It's pretty on the nose, right? But some other ones that you might not quickly tag in a conversation around gender is when in John, no one takes his life, Jesus talking about his own life, he lays it down out of his own volition. This is actually quite a gendered text in the first century, as we'll see here in a minute. And then 1 Timothy 3:2, overseers of the church ought to be sober and self-controlled. And you're like, wait a second. Those texts don't have the word man or woman or male or female or any of those terms in it. But what we're looking at are virtues and values of the first century that are actually very gender coded. Let's take the last one there. Self-controlled is the cardinal virtue of men in the ancient world. It's one of the highest virtues is to be self-controlled, to use reason to guide your passions and to make self-controlled decisions. As we'll see here in a minute, Romans don't believe that women can do this. Only men can be self-controlled. Because we'll unpack this later, don't worry. But these are texts in which if someone in the first century is hearing them, they may be hearing, if they only had these texts without names attached, masculine and feminine qualities to them. The second one, the middle one, John 10:18, is talking about agency, especially as it relates to your death. When you die in the ancient world, to be a really strong masculine man, you better be in control of your death. You better not have anything happen to you, because that would be, well, we'll get there. That's not to be a really manly man, right? To lay your own life down is to be in control of everything in your life, even the end of it, right? So we have famous texts, right? Socrates drinks hemlock, right? To commit suicide rather than be killed. That's viewed in the ancient world as an honorable thing to do. We always have to reframe that in the modern world that suicide is never a good option. In the ancient world, it's a different value. They actually raise that because you can be in control of your life rather than having your life taken from you, which denies you agency. And so all these texts, we're going to look at a couple others as we go through, are actually in that conversation. I always help students to say, when you want to understand a topic, you just can't look up words, right? Concepts go beyond just words, men, women, male, female, but to ways that society constructs these topics. So to do that, we need to take a step back. And when you study biblical studies, you get yourself into all certain odd sections of the library. And so at one point, I was studying ancient Roman medical texts, which I never thought I would do, to see how they thought about how men and women were conceived. Because a lot of their views on men and women are rooted in conception of how babies are born. And then they derive philosophical principles from that. So we have lots of ancient medical texts. Actually, a famous one is a guy named Galen. I don't know if anyone, is anyone in the medical field? Biology, medicine, okay? Galen and a few others were some of the first kind of medical texts in the Roman world to do human dissections. So in the first century, they're starting their first human dissections of the human body. Before that was animals, right? And so they're learning lots, and so they're writing down copious amounts of information. Even like the Hippocratic Oath, right? We get all that in kind of Greek period. And so when they think about how people are born, we've actually moved discussing the Roman idea to what we call a one-sex model. So they don't believe that there's actually two different sexes. They think that there's one, and I'll explain why. So here's Galen on a book entitled On the Usefulness of the Parts of the Body. Had to be a New York Times bestseller in its day, right? Everyone's just clamoring to get their hands on a copy of that. He says, all the parts then that men have, women have too. The difference being between lying in only one thing, which must be kept in mind in the discussion. Namely, that in women the parts are within the body, whereas in men they are outside the body. And you're like, wait a second, what? Just to help us out here, so ancient medical practitioners thought that all babies essentially started off male. And that the thing that determined gender in the ancient world is probably not what you're thinking, what was actually heat. So how warm the mother was throughout her pregnancy would determine whether the baby was male or female. Because they believe that the same body parts are in the body, and it's just with heat they get extracted out of the body. I want to be kind of delicate on a Sunday morning adult formation hour, right? I do this with college students, and it's amazing. It's like, hey guys, this is what we're going to talk about today. But it's useful to know this, to see where we're going to go. And so they believe all the body parts are there, and as the baby warms, they descend out of the body. And I put up a picture of, obviously something that we hope that all are aware of. You can kind of see how they get there in a weird way. Like, I'm not condoning this medical view, but they essentially think that this starts on the inside and then gets flipped outward, essentially. So that the uterine wall comes out, right? The ovaries distend, right? And that's what they're thinking. And so really what they're interested in is with this, and obviously all, just to state the obvious, it's all male doctors writing about bodies, right? So we don't have we have midwives, obviously throughout human history, but they're not writing medical texts. And so these are the best thoughts that the men of the day have, right? And so their leading theory is that the same body parts exist in both of our bodies, and they come outside the body if you've had enough heat during your pregnancy. It's so funny, but it's like literally has the bun in the oven been baked enough, right? Like, like it's literally that. Like, I don't know if you're wearing like enough blankets or something, right? But like that's literally the thought that if a baby comes out female, she didn't have enough heat. She wasn't fully, and this is where it gets problematic, is not fully formed, right? And so they take the male body as the standard, as the typical, and then everything else is riffed off of that in lesser forms of importance. And so this is where it gets kind of real and philosophical and where it has very much downstream consequences, right? So they actually believe that females are not fully formed humans at some level. Their growth has been stunted, essentially, in womb, in utero. And so this, as you can imagine, is going to have a cascading series of effects on a whole bunch of topics if this is the starting point. They were obviously completely wrong, right, on what people start. So they thought all babies start off male and then become female. Obviously through DNA testing and things like that, we actually know it's the exact opposite, right? You know, one small little error, nothing really bad happened after that, right? Yeah, like insert human like history from here, like one going forward, right? So yeah, there are consequences to ideas, obviously. And so with these then, this is why the bodies differ, but it also goes back to, in some ways, philosophical views then on perfection, on the standard, on what's considered normative, right, for humans. And so the male body was the normative body. It was the one that set the standard. And they actually say the female body was a corruption, genetically, of male DNA. And so it's something that hasn't fully formed. And so this is why men then are considered to be ideal, and women are considered to be kind of a corrupted spin off of that there. And so there is this, what we now refer to then as the kind of one-sex model. You essentially have the ideal male, and then you have other cascading types of men that aren't the ideal male, and then you have females at the other end of that spectrum. And so they're basically using physiognomy, I can never pronounce that word, looking at the body to make discussions of importance, value, and the like. Obviously, lots of history has used that as well, not being very effective on that. And so when we look at this then, masculinity then is built on top of that concept. So that's why I use the term ideal man. Sometimes in the text it's like the manly man, however you want to phrase that. It's like the uber sense of that term. And so when we move from the physical then to some of the kind of moral concepts, the big one there then is reason and passions. And so within this, men then can be guided by reason, which is the goal of kind of the philosophical stream of life, is to be able to control your passions. And men can do this. In fact, the term virtue, right, to pursue the virtues, that's a Latin word, and the first three letters of that are ver, which is the Latin term for man. So men are virtuous because they're vers, right? Do you see the connection there? And so, in some sense, women can't be virtuous because that's to pursue a manly quality, right? So to be a virtuous person, to be a good person, right, is to be manly in that sense. We'll do some comparisons and contrasts with some of the New Testament texts here in just a minute. And so in this then, if the goal then is to be controlled by reason, this is why self-control becomes the dominating virtue. Because self-control, coming from the Stoics, is kind of like the Goldilocks principle. They have a pretty wide view of things. You can do anything you want, just not too much, not too little, just the right amount, right? That's the kind of the Stoic idea boiled down. And so self-control is saying you can encounter anything, just don't be overcome by it. Don't be mastered by it. Don't be enslaved to it. Paul actually has some pretty similar ideas of moral development. Don't be a slave to unrighteousness. Don't be controlled by that. Don't be controlled by your bodily appetites. Part of that's just the ancient and really helpful way of thinking about how we live our lives. And so self-control or self-mastery is closely linked with ruling over others. So if I rule myself, I can then rule others. If I bring myself under control, I can bring others under my control. And you can see kind of the Roman conquest in the background, right? Romans are the most virtuous people because they can then control others, right? Self-control leads to control of others. And within this, a masculine man, a manly man is active rather than passive. And this is where that death component comes in. And we kind of still have vestiges of this in kind of popular culture and ways that we talk. They make things happen, to put it in modern language. They create opportunity. Let me use that one, right? That's what men do. They see an obstacle and they make something new out of it. That's very Roman, right? Because you want to be in control of your life. You want to be active. You don't want things to happen to you. You want to be able to take whatever life throws at you. And of course, as I mentioned, this affects how you die, right? So if you're going to be crucified, that in the ancient world is not just a political punishment. It's not just a social tool of terror. It's also a gendered conversation. Because when you crucify someone, or even when you physically assault them, you are effeminizing them. You are taking agency away from them. And we still have some of those vestiges even in our own culture, right? Where, aren't you going to defend yourself? Like if someone hits you in public, like that's never happened to me, try to live a life of peace, right? But the idea is, how are you going to respond if someone hits you, right? And you've all been in like the high school lunchroom, right? When that happens, and someone gets walloped, and you're thinking, okay, how are they going to respond? Are they going to let that happen to them, or are they going to fight back, right? That's very Roman, because you don't want your honor to be tarnished. You don't want your status to be tarnished. And so this obviously comes full force down on how you die. And so you want a glorious death. You want to die in battle, right? I was leading the charge when I got taken out. Or like Socrates, I went out on my own terms, right? I wasn't going to let anyone dictate to me what I was going to do. And so these qualities of morality, manliness are entirely linked together. And so in the Roman world, this ideal behavior becomes bravery, courage. It kind of wraps up all these concepts into very nice categories. And so, classic cash out here is if men represent virtue, well then who's left to represent the other one? Vices are represented by women, right? So men represent the virtues, women represent the vices. Because again, they can't be controlled by reason. They're not in the ancient world considered to be able to do that. So then they're controlled by their passions, right? They can't get their passions under control. And that one obviously still very much looms large in modern conceptions. When we get the phrase, right, women are too what? Emotional. Just FYI, it's a very Roman way of thinking about men and women. I would argue, just make it very clear, that's not a very Christian way of thinking about men and women. The Romans would applaud that. I don't think that's what we see from the actions of Jesus. We certainly don't see the other ways of how Jewish groups are doing this. And I should probably make a little caveat here. So this is very much a Roman way of viewing things. You may ask, okay, what about those Second Temple groups? How did they view men and women? Well, we have horrific texts as well about women from various Jewish groups. However, I would argue that you have a backstop within ancient Judaism. Because we have a text that doesn't let us go full Roman on this one, right? It's Genesis 1 and 2. In his image, he created them what? Male and female. So I argue it's kind of like a backstop to the misogyny at some level. It doesn't practically maybe change much, but there's at least a text within the canon that says, no, women are not a spin-off, right, here. They're not a corrupted version. They fully bear the image of God. And I do think it does have some way of limiting some of the more very, very difficult aspects of this. Again, it's not night and day difference, but it is at least a backstop. I don't know if that makes sense, but they have a text that says, well, they were created equal. The Romans don't have a text that says that. They're very much created unequal in the Roman world. Two last pieces and we'll finish here. The obvious male in the room is the Roman emperor, who sets the standard for being the ideal male. He has the most wealth, the most status, the most honor, the most power. He's in control of the world. He's in control of others. He's pursuing virtues, hopefully, right? And so he kind of sets the standard in the room. And then from there, we kind of moved down. We actually have different terms for men in the ancient world. So I mentioned ver, that's a high status term for a high status male. Enslaved males were sometimes just called anthropos, the general term for kind of guy. So even the term man itself is kind of an honorific title, something that you can pursue. And so there are different ways that they discuss these groups. And obviously in the first century, Augustus and the emperors are defining this category. They're going to war, they're going to battle, and this is how someone exercises their power in relationship to others. And so the emperor really sets the standard. This is why if you've ever been to an archaeological museum and you've seen a picture of Augustus, you notice how he never looks over about the year 30 years old? He actually paused all of his depictions. He got to his ideal form and then was like, yep, this is my picture from here on out. Which I can't make fun of because if you've ever seen a faculty page at a college, right? Something's, like, hey, that's a good picture, right? That's what I want going on the back of the book, right? And so that's simply what Augustus does. He just freezes his photo. He lives to be like 60, but you'll never see like a 60-year-old image of Augustus. You won't find one, right? He's very much in control of that image. Because again, what is he projecting? Health, vitality, youthfulness in some ways, right? And so he's also in control of that image as well. All right, two last things. I'm looking at two of the biggest characters we have in our New Testament, Jesus and Paul, and ask a really interesting question. Where do they fall on kind of these Roman conceptions of masculine identity? Well, first off, we might want to note that they're both ethnic minorities. Right? They're Jewish, they're not Roman. Paul's a Roman citizen. But they're ethnic minorities. It's already a step down, especially for Jesus. He's not a Roman male, so he already falls out of that category. And when we look at all the texts of Jesus getting beaten at the end of his life, I know we've always seen those as basically a precursor to the crucifixion, it's like a pre-beating up before he's killed. But in some ways, they are into a contest of who's the biggest man in the room. And Jesus is getting pummeled by other Roman males. And some of that is a social shaming tactic. They're belittling him, right, in front of others. And then, of course, he's crucified. He's impaled, right, to die in a death, right, that the Romans are enacting upon him. And the Romans did that. That's why they strip you naked, right? That's why they beat you in front of others. And that's why they leave you to die, because they're socially saying you can't defend yourself. You're not being a man. A man would never let this happen to him, right? And so in some ways, it's also a very gendered conversation. There's a really interesting discussion in John's Gospel. We already looked at John 10, where Jesus says, I lay my life down, right? No one takes it from me. So John is kind of giving agency back here a little bit. But there's an interesting conversation with Pilate that if you have this conversation about gender in the back of your head, a little line kind of looms large in their debate with one another. It comes in verse 10. Pilate says to him, do you refuse to speak to me? And then Pilate says, obviously Pilate's a man, right? Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? So now we're under a question about who's the most powerful man in the room. And notice what Jesus says. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. So Jesus says, you don't have any power over me. And this is all a question of like, who's really in control in this room? And Jesus is saying, you think because you're beating me that you have the power, but he says, you've been given power over me. And so this is a text that kind of leaps off the page in that conversation. Yeah?
Yeah, I just want to lift up an insight from Professor Roy Brunner, one of our members. Because when we were at Bruce's book launch, I had a conversation with Steve on and Royce, and he said, he pointed to that, because we were talking about the four Gospels, to John 10:8, and he said, in the Synoptics, Simon of Cyrene picks up Jesus' cross because Jesus falls. He's been so beat up, he's tired, he can't make it to the top of the hill. But that John strategically leaves that out. And so from your analysis, it's almost like, even though John has this theological argument that he's the most powerful
Yeah, it's showing in a sense that Jesus is he's also narrating the events, but and again, it's also that kind of they're recasting it, right? I mean, but the disciples are going to do that too. They're going to look to prophecies, right? The suffering servant of Isaiah, because everyone in the ancient world has to explain how Jesus died, because it's the most horrific way to die. It's the most shameful way to die. And we always probably agreed, yeah, it's the most shameful. We can check that box when we talk about the crucifixion. We might go, oh, because you're naked, because it's brutal, but it's also in the Roman world gendered, and that's why it's shameful for Jesus, because he's being treated without any power, right? And if that's the defining characteristic of self-control, self-mastery, this is the undoing of that. And so there's a little bit of trying to re-engage Jesus on that. And I think you can make them sit together. It's probably a little bit of both. Jesus clearly had options where he could have backed away, even in the synoptics, from the death, right? There's lots of outs for him. And he chooses that. It seems that John is kind of not overemphasizing, kind of recasting that as, no, this really was Jesus' decision. Because it's not as in the synoptics, the crucifixion is a kind of tragic accident, right? It's very much Jesus kind of moves towards that in a way. But yeah, it's interesting to see these categories kind of go around. We can also put Paul there. We're running out of time, but Paul there as well gets beaten numerous times. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about caring for his churches and says, "Who is weak? Do I not feel weak?" In 2 Corinthians 11, again saying, "I'm not strong. I don't have the strength." So there's different ways. And so what this is going to do is going to set us up for next week when we come back and look at the role of women, because it's going to be in juxtaposition, right, to all of these things. And so we've done kind of the first half, and we'll do the second half next week. Any other thoughts or questions on that as we wind down and head over? Yeah.
I just recognize those men in my life, in my experience as an American female, that there's that bully in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
Not that guy.
Yep.
I know that man who's be a real man,
Yep.
go out with a real guy,
Yep.
that real man,
Mhm.
and
Yep.
it's a little nauseating looking at that, going, that's here.
Yeah, I think.
Those men are here.
Yeah, that's one of the really sad parts is that you look back, you go, that isn't as far of history as I'd like to see it removed, right?
Yeah.
That's very present. And there's lots of reasons for that.
Yeah.
Right? America wanted to be the next Rome, right? That's why we're a republic, right? That's why we have a Senate. And so in many ways, we didn't just want the political idea carried over, also the morals, the values, the conquering, right? And so it's not surprising that we see those kind of revivified. And that's why I was saying to someone earlier, right? It's really interesting. We study the Roman world, even in some Christian circles, right? It's winning the Roman world back. And as we're going to see with Jesus and Paul, I think they're actively working against some of those models in the Roman world. That's what's staggering from like kind of a historian's perspective, is that you're just trying to rebuild what I think Jesus and Paul were trying to tear down. And that's the really unsettling factor of like, we're at cross purposes here. Because Jesus and Paul don't fit the categorical ideal male in the Roman world. They're less than that.
And those men are in the church.
Yeah.
Those are our church leaders. Those have been our church male
Yeah.
leaders in U.S. history.
Yeah, that's where we're trying to look back to these characters and say, okay, what vision were they casting out, and how do we work for that today? Yeah, that's one of the difficult parts of that. All right, well, we'll get to church. We'll come back next week and look at women in the Roman world and see how Paul and Jesus also interact with that as well. All right.